10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 220. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 220 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. You know what this week is. It's our Tune of the Month, where we try to wrap up the series from the month and write you an etude so that you can start to get some real life experience with the topics we were talking about. And this month has obviously been the topic of fourths, so we picked a great Miles Davis tune-up to take a look at this week. Before we jump into the show, just remember that you can grab the etude. I do it in concert pitch, B-flat, E-flat, and bass clef, and you can get that at our Patreon website. You can find that by going to 10minutejazzlesson.com, clicking on one of the Patreon links, and that will bring you over and give you instant access to all 220 PDFs that we've ever done. Just wanted to give a quick shout out to David and Chris this week for editing their pledges up to $5 a month from the $3 mark. Really appreciate both of you doing that. And there's been a lot of people that have actually been upping their amounts. So thank you. Thank you. That really does so much to keep the podcast in business. And of course, thank you to everybody that's doing their $3 pledges each month. We've got over 300 members over there, and it really means the world to me. All right, let's jump into today's episode. So as I mentioned, we are going to be looking at the great Miles Davis composition tune-up. This is another one of those short jazz standards that is only a 16-bar form, but really utilizes so many of the different techniques and chord progressions that we see so often in the jazz language. So this one really utilizes the 2-5-1 progression to a really high degree. It's basically just a series of descending 2-5-1 progressions. This tune is actually really similar to the tune Solar. It has a lot of the same chord movement. It's the same length. So there's a lot of similarities there. And if you haven't checked out our episode on Solar, go back and look that one up. And I think you'll find a lot of the same concepts. So let's go over the tune. Let's look at it in its entirety. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the etude, but mostly this episode is going to be about breaking down this tune. So let's just take a peek at it from the very top. So if we look at the first chord, what we have is a concert E minor 7 chord going to A7, going to D major 7. So that is a pretty clear-cut 2-5-1 in the key of D major. Now the D major chord becomes the 2 of the next key, so we're going down by whole steps here. So now what we have starting in measure 5 is D minor 7 to G7 to C major 7. So another 2-5-1, this time in the key of C, moving down a whole step from that key of D. Now we do that movement one more time. The C major 7 chord becomes a minor chord and becomes the 2 of the next key. So now we have C minor, F7 to B flat major 7. So all we've done is we've moved through 3 different major keys by way of a 2-5-1. We've gone from the key of D down to the key of C, down to the key of B flat. And we see this in so many jazz standards. We see this exact same movement. So this is a really important progression to kind of get used to. I want you to be able to pick out this particular progression. 2-5-1s moving down by whole steps. This is actually also a great way to practice 2-5-1 licks, is to simply turn the major key into the 2 of the key a whole step down. And that's a great way to sort of run through your lines when you're trying to put them in multiple keys. Now, the only tricky thing is the last 4 bars of this progression. This is where we start to see it step outside of that 2-5-1 movement, and it does something kind of funky. Now, technically, this tune has a first first and a second ending. And the second ending is actually just a regular old 2-5-1 in the key of D again. But in the first ending, which is the one that I'm using in the etude for this week, because I feel like it's a little bit more valuable to talk about this particular progression because it's just kind of outside of the norm of your regular 2-5-1. So what we see in measure 13 is we see an E minor 7 chord again. So in your mind, you're going, okay, this is the 2 chord in the key of D, but this is not actually what happens. So we see the E minor chord followed by a concert F7 chord. So there's a half step movement there, E minor to F7. And then the F7 actually becomes the 5 chord of B flat major. And that's actually the chord that we see it resolve to. So it's E minor 7 to F7 to B flat major 7. So what it does is it kind of fakes you out halfway through that phrase. We're so used to hearing just these straight up 2-5-1 progressions. We've just heard literally 3 of them. So it's right for us to assume that we're about to do another one, but he kind of pulls a fast one on you and does a bit of a deceptive cadence, but actually the deception kind of comes halfway through the cadence where we just move up a half step from that E minor chord to the F7 chord, and that becomes our 5-to-1 relationship. So I know a lot of my students have had trouble sort of figuring out what that progression is and where it comes from, and I would just call it a deceptive cadence. You know, that's not the technically correct term because a deceptive cadence usually goes from the 5 chord of one key and doesn't go to the 1 chord that you're expecting, but I'm still just going to call it a deceptive cadence for lack of a better term, if that makes sense. So that's it. That's basically the movement of everything. Now, obviously, we've been talking about fourths this month, so I do want to talk about the etude a little bit. But first, let me play it for you, and then I'm just going to give you a couple of things to look for in this etude, and then I'm going to kind of let you dig in for yourself. But let's play the etude first. So one thing you'll notice is that sounds fairly different from most of the things that I write for you guys, and that is simply just because of the presence of so many fourths. Now, what I try to do is I try to be really, really explicit about the fourths in certain sections, and then in other parts of the etude, I tried to mix them in with a little bit more natural sounding things for me, because obviously it's not going to sound good if you just play an entire solo of fourths. That's not what we're after here. We're really after you being able to sort of seamlessly work some of these fourths into your playing. So let's pick out a couple of those spots. So if you are to look at actually, the first 4 measures is a great example. So I start by just playing a simple scale pattern over the first measure, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I jump up to 7. But then if you notice in the second measure, now I'm really starting to use my fourths. So if you look at the second beat of the second measure, you'll start to notice that I'm using that up-down pattern of fourths. And that continues for the rest of that measure until I resolve into the third measure. And then I'm going back into some normal stuff. It's just a scale pattern going down. But then in the second half of measure 3, I'm using those fourths again. So you might say, well, it's a little bit too heavy on the fourths for me. You know, I don't really like that sound of those fourths happening that often. But you have to remember that I'm basing the entire etude off of the fourths. And I'm really trying to get as many in there as I can while still making it sound somewhat natural. It's an interesting balance I have to try to achieve when I'm writing some of these etudes. But what I would like you to do is first, I would like you to go through and I would like you to identify every single place that I'm using one of those fourths patterns that I taught you guys. And once you have all of those extracted, then try to look at what's around those fourths, how I'm leading into them, how I'm getting out of using the fourths, and just really see how it kind of all fits together. And I think that should illuminate the concept a little bit more. So I'm going to play the etude one more time for you, but this time I want you to really try to use what you've already worked on to your advantage. And without looking at the PDF, I want you to see if you can hear where some of those fourth sections are. See if you can pick those up by ear. And I think you'll find that you're pretty successful on this if you've done your homework and you've got some of the fourths in your ears already. I think you'll be able to hear that without looking at the etude. So try that. Just close your eyes, listen to the etude go by, and see if you could start to pick out some of those sections that I'm really going heavy on the fourths by ear. Let's try it. So this can be a really good barometer. If you can start to pick those out by ear, you know that you've done a fair amount of work on these intervals of a fourth and tritone. If you're having trouble doing that, maybe go back to the first episode in the series and just start working your way through those exercises really, really slowly to try to cement that interval of a fourth into your ears. So that's going to about do it. Remember, if you want to grab the etude so that you have the study guide, you can do that by going to 10minutejazzlesson.com, clicking on one of the Patreon banners, sign up. It only costs you $3 a month, and you get literally hundreds of PDFs that you can use to continue your jazz education on hundreds of different topics. Hope you all are having a great week out there. Let me know if you have any questions in the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Community Facebook group. That's the best place to get in touch with me. Hope you enjoy the etude, and we'll see you next week with a brand new episode. Hope you're all staying safe and healthy out there. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.